Hi, this figure is an Imperial Garrison trooper, and it comes from the initial set of 14 single-pose metal miniatures that was created for Warhammer 40,000 before even the release of the Warhammer Rogue Trader rulebook. This is one of 5 human soldiers that was in that set. There was also a light trooper, which was pretty much the same figure but had a gas mask. There were 2 heavy troopers that had significantly more armour, and a ground combat trooper. Now, all of these would actually be rebranded as mercenaries during the Rogue Trader era, but really they form the origins of what was later to become known as the Imperial Army, then the Imperial Guard, and finally the Astra Militarum. And in this video I'm going to look at how the figures developed over the years. With the release of Rogue Trader, the regular human soldiers of the Imperium were officially known as the Imperial Army, and there was a considerable range of miniatures to go with this. These were all single-pose metal sculpts, although there were some heavy weapons specialists where you just got a single-pose gunner and you put whichever weapon you wanted onto their shoulder. This is one of the regular infantry troopers though, and I'm sure you'll be able to notice that this is actually a female trooper, because the fact that every single figure had to be individually sculpted meant that they could be given vastly different appearances. Whatever the sculptor could manage, it didn't have to fit with a piece of equipment that would be stuck onto a figure with a totally different pose. So we got all sorts of different poses, equipment, and we also got a few female troops. At this point as well, abhumans were still really just part of the Imperial Army as normal. None of them had their own army lists, and for that reason there was also another range of single-pose metal figures that could be used for the Imperial Army. And that range of figures were squats. They too had a full range of single-pose metal models. They wore flak armour, they carried las guns, but they did not at this point have their own distinct army list. And in fact, in chapter approved, the Book of the Astronomicon, the army list for the Imperial Army included units and characters that were squats, so they were all meant to be used together at this point in the game's history. The first major update to the range of figures available for the Imperial Army also came with a change of name. Gone was the Imperial Army, and now we had the Imperial Guard. You could, of course, still get all the old Imperial Army figures from Games Workshop's mail order, and they would still work with the new rules, but now we had figures such as this one. And this, rather than being a single-pose metal miniature, has a metal head and torso, and then the arms and the lasgun came on separate plastic sprues. And given that the weapons sprue had a las cannon, 5 las guns and a couple of las pistols on, that meant that just with 4 or 5 core bodies, you could produce a lot of different potential models using those extra plastic parts. At the same time as the metal-bodied figures with the plastic arms and weapons were released, there was also a box set of entirely plastic multi-part figures released. You got 36 guardsmen for £10. That was pretty much the way it worked at that time for Warhammer 40,000. And these had heads and bodies made of plastic. And then the arm and weapon sprues were exactly the same as those used with their metal-bodied cousins. The parts were entirely interchangeable. The only difference was these were lighter and cheaper than the metal versions, although I do think the metal versions were slightly better detailed as a result of the casting technology available at the time. I will also highlight this model that came out at the same time as the previous two, and this is the grenade launcher gunner for the tactical squads of the day. Now, this time a grenade launcher was actually considered a heavy weapon, had a range of 60 inches on the battlefield, and with a full range of grenades available, including vortex grenades if you were willing to pay a lot of points. It was a very powerful weapon to have. Now, this figure, the weapon was not on a sprue. It came actually on the figure, but the left arm here was on a separate sprue. It matches the left arm on some of the lasgun-armed Imperial Guardsmen at the time, and I really don't know why, because you really had to use that arm. You had to use it in that position, so why they didn't just sculpt this as a single pose metal figure, I don't know, because effectively that is what it is. During the years of Rogue Trader, all Imperial Guard regiments looked the same. The style of their uniforms was identical. Just that one range of figures covered soldiers from every world in the Imperium. The most variation you could get was if you specifically just used the older Imperial Army figures instead of the later Imperial Guard ones. But again, doesn't matter where they come from, they look alike. The only variation is whatever colour you chose to paint them. That changed during 2nd edition, with the release of a box set of 10 single pose figures, such as this one you see here, and they were the Jungle Fighters of Catachan. Now, obviously, these are supposed to be based on sort of the appearance of Americans, specifically American Special Forces, the Green Berets, while fighting in Vietnam. The red headband is obviously a nod to the Rambo character, played by Sylvester Stallone, and there's even the Sly Marbo special character that came later. Although you will never convince me otherwise that Catachans are anything other than Australian. Now, this was not a one-off, and over the next few months after this set was released, there was a whole variety of different Imperial Guard regiments introduced to the game. Next to be released were the Cadians, and no, I don't care how it's supposed to be said. These were another set of 10 single pose metal figures. You got a complete squad in one box set. And as for the inspiration for these, well, I've heard some people say the film Starship Troopers. That would be very clever, given that this figure predates that film. And of course, the novel Starship Troopers had the soldiers in powered armour, so that's out of the question. They do remind me vaguely of the Colonial Marines from Aliens, but I think that's mainly because of the shape of the helmet, and the helmet is just an M1 American helmet, so they could be American troops again, although given how widely distributed those helmets were following World War II, I think you could just generally say these are meant to be the equivalent of a generic 20th to 21st century soldier from Earth. After the Cadians came the Valhallan Ice Warriors, and these obviously draw their inspiration from the Red Army of the Soviet Union, specifically during the time of the fighting on the Eastern Front during World War II. And once again, you got a full squad of single pose metal figures in a single box set. The next set to be released were the Mordian Iron Guard in their very fancy uniforms. Look quite a bit like the dress uniforms worn by a lot of armies today. I've heard these compared to the dress blues of the United States Marine Corps, but I believe the inspiration for these may well have been Prussian troops from roughly the time of the Napoleonic Wars, although I can't be certain about that. And the last of this phase of second edition releases for the Imperial Guard were the Talon Desert Raiders. And these obviously have a very Mid-Eastern appearance to them, sort of Lawrence of Arabia, possibly Bedouin, or maybe even Afghani tribesmen, Mujahideen sort of soldiers. Although whatever the inspiration was, they again had the standard format of a box set of 10 single pose metal figures. And in all of these squad sets, you got a sergeant, you got a special weapon, and you got the two-man heavy weapons team, which had now become standard. And for quite some time, this was pretty much what you got. There was a blister packs release with extra riflemen in, and alternate sergeants, special weapons, officers, and heavy weapons were all released. But for most of second edition, you didn't get any new styles of soldiers. This all changed at a Games Day event, though, when some Mordian Iron Guard were converted by Games Workshop. The flat peak cap heads were replaced with pith helmets. They were given smart red tunics, and they became the Praetorian 24th. Obviously, these are based off colonial-era British troops, and the regimental designation suggests specifically the 24th Regiment of Foot that took part in the Anglo-Zulu War and the famous battles at Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift. The display, called the I think it's a massacre or the Battle at Big Tooth River, was so popular, and people started demanding to know when these figures would be released, that Games Workshop put out a box set that was actually more than just a single squad. You got 2 infantry squads, a heavy weapons squad, and some command figures with a commissar. So that was quite a good start to a collection, and it's actually how I started collecting Imperial Guard myself. Of course, later on, you also got blister packs released, and you could mail order whatever extra figures you wanted. However, that was it for second edition. For third edition, Games Workshop finally released some multi-part plastic figures again. The original Rogue Trader ones had long been discontinued, and that made collecting Imperial Guard very expensive because all you had was single pose metal figures. But this set of 20 multi-part Catachans would give you 2 infantry squads in a single set. Of course, later on that was cut down to just 10 men, but still it was cheaper than the single pose metal. And amongst these multi-part plastics, as well as regular riflemen, you would also get the option for a flamer, a vox caster, and a sergeant. It should be noted that the single pose metal Catachans weren't done for yet, though. The previous set of figures you could still buy. They were particularly useful for the extra weapon options they gave you. You could still get plasma guns and melter guns, as well as all the different heavy weapons in the single pose metal format. And with the release of a dedicated Codex Catachans, there were some more specialist figures in there, such as this sniper, and there was also demo charge equipped troopers, and Games Workshop produced some more single pose metal miniatures to go with them. Of course, one interesting aspect is that this meant that technically the Catachan Jungle Fighters were sort of speciality troops, whereas all of the other regiments were your regular Imperial Guard, using the standard Imperial Guard Codex. But it was only the speciality ones that actually had their core infantry available in plastic, whereas for your regular troops, you had to use single pose metal figures. As you'll see later, this wasn't actually the first time something like that had happened. Games Workshop weren't done with the single pose metal regiments though, and later on in 3rd edition we got the Armageddon Steel Legion, and once again you got a box set of a 10-man squad that included a sergeant, a special weapon and a 2-man heavy weapons team. And then later on, blister packs were released to give you extra riflemen, different special weapons, although there was only one extra special weapon released, a plasma gun instead of the grenade launcher in the box set, and some extra heavy weapon options. Moving on to 4th edition, and we got a new multi-part plastic kit for the Cadians. And from this point onwards, really, you can effectively call Cadians the de facto standard Imperial Guard regiment. Even if your regiment's not supposed to be from Cadia, you would probably use Cadian figures and just paint them up differently and give them different names on their vehicles. Again, I think the first set of these released had 20 men in the box set, later reduced to 10, and you got options for a sergeant, a voxcaster, and as well as a flamer, you also got a grenade launcher option in the kit. As had been done with the Catachans back in 3rd edition, the Cadian plastic release was supported as well by several single pose metal figures, and these would have the other special weapons that weren't available in the kit, or would be character models, and the range was expanded upon even further with multi-part plastic heavy weapons and a command squad. Now the command squad did include all the special weapon options, but the single pose metal special weapons also continued to be made available by Games Workshop. The Imperial Guard were also included in Games Workshop's range of easy-to-assemble kits, and these are sort of, I think I'd call them pocket money kits. I think they were £5 each, and you just got a handful of basic soldiers in them. And in the Imperial Guard one, you just got 5 men with las guns that would clip together and clip in to a 25mm slaughter base. No glue needed. And in a previous video, I advised people to buy these because even though they didn't have any weapon options in, they were a really good way to cheaply bulk out your army. And it was a great disappointment when this range of figures was discontinued. Games Workshop wasn't done giving us new regiments for the Imperial Guard yet, though, and towards the end of 4th edition, we were given the Praetorian Firstborn. Again, these are single-pose metal figures, and as well as the riflemen with their very ornate-appearing lasguns, we got some special weapons, heavy weapon teams, and some character models. Now, over the years, a lot of these were deleted. The Praetorians vanished from the Games Workshop catalogue at about the time the Vostroyans were released. But it wasn't actually until 7th edition that we then saw any significant change, and that had nothing to do with the figures, because the Imperial Guard ceased to be the Imperial Guard in 7th edition, and they became the Astra Militarum. For new figures in the regular range, we had to wait until 9th edition. 9th edition brought us the long sought after release of multi-part plastic Death Corps of Krieg. The Death Corps of Krieg, I believe, began actually as Armageddon Steel Legion models, just repainted and called Death Corps of Krieg. Then Forge World released dedicated resin models, which were very popular, although the Forge World releases are outside the purview of my video today. And it wasn't until a version of Kill Team was being released that had a squad of these soldiers in it that we finally got plastic Death Corps of Krieg for Warhammer 40,000. The release of the 9th edition Codex Astra Militarum was accompanied by a total range refresh for the Cadians, and we got a brand new set of multi-part plastic Cadians. Of course, the previous ones were getting a bit long in the tooth. They were going back to 4th edition, although oddly, the Catachans, which go back even further to 3rd edition, they are still available. But I do think these are nicer figures than the previous ones, and these have now completely replaced the previous generation of Cadians. As well as regular infantry, the idea that the Imperium used some form of special forces other than Space Marines has been around for a long time. As you can see with this figure, this I think it's actually an Iron Claw figure, going back to the days of Rogue Trader. And this is a jump trooper. There was never a proper entry in an army list, but the advert for it in the Book of the Astronomicon did give the profile for the soldier and the details of his equipment if you wanted to add them to your Imperial Army force. The 2nd edition Imperial Guard Codex did, however, have Imperial Guard stormtroopers in it. And here we have one of those stormtroopers. At this point, they were organised a lot more like the regular infantry squads than the later versions of elite troops. You still got a special weapon and a heavy weapons team in the squad. It's just that instead of regular lasguns, you had hotshot lasguns, and the soldiers were of better quality. And these regular riflemen for the squad were released in a set of 6 plastic clip-together figures. So again, at the time, all your regular infantry were single-pose metal, whereas your elite special forces, most of them were available in cheaper plastic. It was only the riflemen that were available in plastic, though, for the 2nd edition Stormtroopers, and so that meant that models like this plasma gunner for your squad's special weapons selection instead had to be made of metal, and there were single-pose metal special weapons, either a plasma gun or a melter gun. There were sergeants, and there were a couple of heavy weapon team options, either a heavy bolter or an autocannon. 3rd edition saw Imperial Guard Stormtroopers redone entirely as single-pose metal figures, and I think they became far more sort of assault troops in this than just superior quality line troops, because you lost the ability to give them a heavy weapon, but you could get more special weapons in there instead. So the idea is, of course, they're going to get up close and attack the enemy at short range. Once again, they are better equipped than the regular troops with a better weapon, and now they also have carapace armour instead of just flak armour. And overall, I think actually this has been my favourite design of the Imperial Guard Stormtrooper. Later on in 3rd edition, we were introduced to the Kazakin, elite Cadian troops, who are really stormtroopers in all but name. Their equipment and their profiles were exactly the same, but the difference was, I believe you can have a couple of units of these as regular troops in Cadian forces. And these miniatures first supplanted the existing stormtrooper figures and then replaced them. It was during 6th edition that we finally got a full range of multi-part plastic stormtroopers, although they weren't called stormtroopers anymore. From this point, they were called Tempestus Scions. And in fact, not only were they elite troops within the Imperial Guard, but they also got a codex all of their own for a short while. We had not heard the last of the Kazakin, though, and in 9th edition we got a multi-part plastic kit that included a full squad and all the weapon options inside to go with the new codex. Although in fact it was this particular kit was released ahead of the others, because it again was released with a version of the Kill Team game. That's why when I bought it, I delayed assembling the models, because rather than a Kill Team, I wanted to assemble mine to match the upcoming 9th edition Astra Militarum Codex. And just to finish with, here they are, the many changing faces of the Imperial Guard, from the first Garrison trooper to the latest Astra Militarum. Although I think Imperial Guard is always how I will view them. And I hope you've enjoyed this review of these figures. Thanks for watching. Bye.